just resumed. Okay, we're back. I'm back
Okay.
with my cold brew.
All right.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. So maybe this would be a good time to get into, if you don't mind, and if this format is okay with you, I'll go for about 15 minutes, and then maybe you can have, whatever you'd like to do. We don't have to be formal about it, but because the case I'm about to make is probably not that familiar to your audience, it would be
Go
nice
ahead.
if I can present it in sort of
Yep,
one
go ahead.
shot.
I'm grabbing a notepad so I can take notes, but go ahead. I'm
Okay.
listening.
So we talked a little bit about the fundamentals, the epistemology, and things like that, and we won't go into that. The goal here is to look for what is a good place to start. So when we think about property, what is the concept of property based on is a good place to start. I know, Stephan, your position is more about scarcity and conflict prevention, and these are not incorrect in the sense that it's easier to grasp it at that level. So it's quite easy to understand why many people would do that. It's somewhat intuition based, and that's what is the appeal of it, that many people can grasp it right away. But in my mind, it doesn't get to the fundamentals. And since we are talking about the moral case, if we don't get to the fundamentals, we can make some big mistakes. So uh, to begin, property is a moral concept, not an economic concept. And it is actually, to be more precise, it's a normative concept. So
Totally agree, by the way, but keep going. Totally
thank you.
agree.
So, and Rand actually is, as far as I know, the only person who digs into it at that level, looking for that is, and she's applying her methods here. The methods of observe and then abstract. And so you'll see the method at work, even though I'm not going to go into the details of that. But it's very, for someone who's immersed in philosophy, you'll get a good sense of how she gets to these root descriptions. So she starts with what facts of reality give rise to the need for values. She doesn't just start by who should benefit from someone's actions or what problem are we trying to solve. To her, that would be incorrect. It would be like you're not observing the world, looking into the facts of the world, and then trying to reach your conclusions from that. So she starts off with observing facts in the world like, hey, there's living things and there's inanimate things. And living things face the conditionality of life, inanimate things don't. So living things are then seen to, they pursue things that are needed to sustain their lives. So, and pursue means slightly different things depending on the context. So for a plant, the values are things like water and sunlight, perhaps. For an animal, the values are slightly higher level. And for humans, of course, they are even higher level than animals. But the basic point is that there are some things without which human beings stop living. They basically go from being living to inanimate if those things are unfulfilled. And that's what she calls values. She defines them as a value is that which one acts to gain or to keep. That she gets that from this inductive process of looking at animate living things across the board. And so this is as fundamental as it gets because plants have values, animals have values, humans have values. This is not starting philosophizing at some level of economics, but it's getting down to existence type of things, observing existence. And since many of people in your audience are Austrians, I'm going to get into a Crusoe example because that's a very familiar one to most people in this audience. So imagine Crusoe on the island. He faces the conditionality of life. So I'm trying to concretize what I just said that
Yep.
was more theoretical. Crusoe faces the conditionality of life. He needs certain things. He needs to catch fish, perhaps. He needs coconuts. He needs to start a fire so he can cook the fish because he realizes that, hey, eating raw fish is not particularly good, whatever it is. But he must first use his mind to identify them as values. So there's a cognitive part of it. And then he has to produce them. And even in producing them, he has to identify, there's a cognitive part of knowing what the means are of how he has to, what what actions he has to take. So there's cognition involved through the whole process. But here's the key part, and that is, in some bigger sense, there might be a certain limited number of or finite number of fish in the lagoon, but the values that Crusoe is looking for, those are the ones that are scarce. It's the caught fish, it's the plucked coconut, it's so to think of this in terms of materials is actually an error. The scarcity is that of values that man has to produce. Now, I'm going to add one more layer to this. Let's say Friday comes along. But here's the twist. Friday is an indestructible, immortal robot, which, Stephan, you may recognize is an Ayn Rand method that she used to make certain points in her objectivist ethics.
Yeah, and I think it's flawed, like the evenly rotating economy is flawed, because there cannot be an indestructible robot. You
No, but
you couldn't know that he was indestructible. But yeah, I'm definitely familiar with all this. And
I'm using it only to
yeah.
make a point. I'm not suggesting that men are indestructible robots.
I know, but that's why we use the evenly rotating economies to make a point, to isolate something. But
so Friday being this indestructible person is he doesn't face the conditionality of life that Crusoe does. So he the same materials exist for him, but there are no values in his life because he doesn't need anything. Not facing. So this is a way to illustrate a simple point. Nothing more, nothing less.
I know. But by the way, I know. I've written on this. I disagree with that example, by the way. But I know that's what she's trying to illustrate. I think the example fails. But
she is using that for some other purposes. I brought this into the Crusoe example to make a different point, which is it illustrates that if Crusoe's life was not conditional, then there would be no such thing as values. He would not have to think. He would not have to create, cognitively identify them, and then figure out how to produce them. And that is the main point in this. And there are other. So this is if we get to the point where we understand that if life wasn't conditional, there'd be no values. So you start to realize that there's something odd about the scarcity of materials. It hasn't gotten to the point of man's interaction with that to make them into values. And those are the things that are scarce. So if we talk about scarcity without getting to values, we're actually missing the point. And we're making a fundamental approximation, which we might think is good, but we're missing something a little more fundamental, and that can lead us to some significant errors. There are other examples of this which we can talk about. Oil that was in Pennsylvania it was there for centuries, just bubbling out of the ground or whatever it was. It was a material, but it wasn't a value. And
well, fact, or as economists would say, it wasn't a good yet. It was even a bad, maybe. But yeah, this concept is not that new to Rand, but I don't disagree with it.
I'm trying to make a point, a logical chain that perhaps your audience will see is
right. Go ahead. Yeah. So, by the way, I'm familiar with all this, and I agree with most of it, except for some of the terms.
Okay.
Like you could define scarcity the way you're using it in values, but go ahead, keep going.
All right. So the oil example is interesting because there too it might even have been finite in some sense of how many million barrels of oil there are or something like that, but it is not a value until man, using his cognitive faculties, makes it a value. And that's a big part. So there's an intellectual component to that, and then it has to be converted into something, it has to be used in something. So all that entire chain, so the focus on materials is superficial. That's the point. So scarcity of materials, even means, if you say means without means to what end, the end is what matters, and that's where the values come in. So
that's true, but we're not ghosts. You recognize that, and Randy even said that we're not ghosts.
We're not.
Material things actually do matter.
And I'm going to talk mainly about material things. You'll notice my examples are material, but and I'll make this point a little more cohesively in a couple of minutes. So I'm with you on that. We are not ghosts. Man is a unity of mind and body. I think that the focus on body alone is actually superficial, which I would suggest the Rothbardians tend to do, focusing a little more on the body and to the exclusion of the mind. And in doing so, they miss some critical process. But let's carry on. So the value is not the scarce material. It is the value that it represents to the rational mind of the person who produces it in their life, for their life. So from there, I want to get into property because that's what we're really after. Our discussion is setting the stage for what is the root of property. But the key takeaway from that, the examples given, and we can have other examples as well, which I'll be happy to bring up later on. But man must first conceive of the values that are necessary to maintain his life. He doesn't find them in nature. So there's a cognitive part of identifying the values. Then there's additional mental processes where he must identify the means by which these values are created or obtained. And then he must act. So the physical part is built in. So I'm not ignoring, this is not the man is a ghost idea. There's all of these processes, but to ignore the intellectual, the cognitive, the conceptual is to be superficial. So the unity of mind and body, it means that that the creation of values are what sustains his life. It's not just the body. So Rand has a very interesting quote, which I'll take a minute to read. The action required to sustain human life is primarily intellectual. Everything man needs has to be discovered by his mind and produced by his effort. Again, mind and effort, mind and body. Production is the application of reason to the problem of survival. So this is kind of the bigger picture that captures both cognitive and the action part of it. So the big conclusion, the radical conclusion that Rand reached in this process is all property is fundamentally intellectual property. So that's the main aspect of this, is that it's not as though there's this property that does not have some component of conceptualizing. There may be less or more, and I'll read you one more quote from Rand, which is very relevant. It's actually from her 1964 essay on patents and copyrights, which I'm sure you've read. It says, every type of productive work involves a combination of mental and physical effort, of thought and of physical action to translate that thought into a material form. The proportion of these two elements varies in different types of work. At the lowest end of the scale, the mental effort required to perform unskilled manual labor is minimal. At the other end, and this is what the patent and copyright laws acknowledge, is the paramount role of mental effort in the production of material values. End quote. So property rights actually secure the values, the material values that are born of the human mind. That's the root of property. And I haven't got to property rights yet. So we just talked about where property begins, and that's if you give me a couple more minutes, I want to connect them to property
Go ahead.
rights.
Good, take your time.
Thank you. And then we'll talk about intellectual property. Those are my two other.
And by the way, I am intimately familiar with all this, of course, and I understand it, and there's a grain of truth in it. But there's probably lots of people that are listening or that have listened to Austrian and libertarian stuff. They've never read a lot. They don't even understand the Randian approach. Like, I think you need to understand the Randian approach and appreciate it, and to see, well, in my view, where she goes astray. But this is probably helpful to set the framework for where you're coming from. So go ahead.
Thank you. And I think that's, so if people haven't heard this, then at least they'll understand that the approach here builds from fundamentals. It is probably more convenient, to think in terms of scarcity, because those are easier concepts rather than thinking in terms of value and the cognitive component and the physical component. But superficial does not mean that it's correct. It means that you might be missing something important, and you might reach wrong conclusions. It's possible to reach a wrong conclusion.
Totally agree with that. Totally
Okay.
agree. Although what I would say is, probably what's going on is that a deeper understanding of all these interconnections can help you clarify, hone, and deepen your understanding. If nothing else, like there's no downside to it. But go ahead.
Yes, and also because people like you are thought leaders in this area, um, you are certainly familiar with this, and you're able to delve at this level into the detail of it. So yes, it may be easier to explain scarcity, but you're able to go to the root of the of the description. That means we should be able to get it right and then explain it to others. That's all I'm saying here. And I think Rand does that, and this is where maybe you and I disagree. So I've got two more main points to make.
Go
I'm
ahead.
going to get
Go ahead.
into property
Go ahead.
rights and then how it applies to IP. So
Go ahead.
we'll start I'll throw in a couple of definitions, because otherwise, if I don't define my terms, then I'm not doing my job in this discussion. So let me talk about that. So actually, one step before I define rights. So there's nothing inherent. Rights are not inherent in humans. There's no intrinsic thing that we can point to. Oh, there's a right, or there's a right out there in nature that I can point to. They're not objects in the world. They're a conceptual thing. So Rand's definition is that rights are a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. So the point there is that there's a sphere of action, and in this sphere, you cannot be coerced. And we are formulating this as a principle. So a right to property is that I have a liberty to use this property to the benefit of my life, and it's a area that you're calling a sphere of action. That's what a right is. But it's important to note there's nothing intrinsic about a right. That's a key point. And let's also say, what is exactly is property? I talked about values. I'm going to talk about property now. Property is, this is the simplest definition that I can think of, any material value that is created and used by someone. So that's as basic as it gets. So Crusoe, for example, on the island, he has property. Once if he catches a fish, it's his property. Now the concept of property
By
rights.
the way, I totally disagree, but you can keep going.
Okay.
And you haven't defined what you keep adding the word material to value. Earlier, you said value is like a subjective thing, like it's something you act to gain and or keep. But now you're adding material, even though you rejected materiality and physicality. And I don't agree that Crusoe has any property rights whatsoever if he's alone on an island.
I haven't said that. I haven't said he has any property rights. The concept of property exists even without a social context. Remember, rights
Right.
are a
And
moral
that's
principle.
what I'm disagreeing with. But
Yeah, but so
go ahead.
well, I'm not saying that Crusoe has property rights when he's by himself.
Well, then what's property if it's not a right? Then
that the point is the material value that is created and used by someone is property.
yeah, but what does material add to you keep saying value? Why do you say material in front of it?
There are things in the world. It's that simple. The things in the world that whether you have it, I have it, Crusoe has it.
So you do have a physicalist view of some things.
Oh yes, everything I'm talking about is a material value in the world. It's not some ideation. So I'm not talking about, and I'll get to that when I get to property, to intellectual property. This is not some there's a mental component, but there's a material value in the world, and we're only talking.
Okay, so
about
just clarification. So like the novel Atlas Shrugged, the pattern of that novel that defines what that novel is that a material value or not?
I'll get to that in a bit. There is a material value there, but I haven't got to that yet, and I think we'll get out of sequence in the description there.
So I'm derailing you. Go ahead.
No, you're not, but I'm just saying that it'll be confusing to anyone who's listening to this if we get off topic and miss certain key aspects of it. So we talked about property as any material value that is created and used by someone. So Crusoe has a concept of property, perhaps, but not property rights, because, as I said, rights exist in a social context. So when Friday shows up, that's when the social context might exist if they are thinking along those lines, and they might be able to conceptualize the concept of property rights. But that's a key part of it. So property represents, this will sort of get to this, your question about the material aspect of it. Property represents the values that are conceived and then created in the material world by individuals. So you conceive the value and then you create it. So land, for example, by itself, fallow land is not property until you do something to it. You convert it into a value. So the value represented in the use of the land, not the land itself, because otherwise, in fact, this will apply to some of your concepts about homesteading and so on. It's the use of the material that what we are talking about. That's why it's important to know that. And then once again, the type of the value gives it context. So, for example, a wild animal. When does a wild animal become value? Well, you can't just point to a deer out there and say, "Hey, that's mine." You have to lay your hands on it, perhaps. So there's a concept of it becomes a value. So each material that you think about becomes a value when you have converted it into a material value. Until then, it's just a thing, and then or a material which you have to convert it into a value. So the source of all property actually is value creating productivity. It's not labor, it's not scarcity, but value creating productivity that Crusoe or you or I have to do in order to turn a material into a value. And that's why we're talking about the material aspect of it. So now we get to property rights. But we define property, and so the definition of property rights is sort of similar. It borrows from it. It says the right to acquire, use, and dispose of those material values. It's that simple. There's nothing more, nothing less. So we said a property is any material value that is created and used by someone, and a property right is the right to acquire, use, and dispose of those material values. So that's about the most fundamental level of understanding property and property rights. So what property rights do is they secure, under the law, a domain of freedom for an individual to create the values and then use them to live their life. That's it. It's that simple in conceptual terms and that fundamental. So, and then as I mentioned, since property itself is contextual, like a certain type of context applies to land, a different context applies to animals, a different context applies to a stream of water. So property rights are also contextual. And if you understand the context of the value, then the property rights will follow that. And this is a key part of what comes next, which is we're going to apply it to intellectual property. And then I'll be glad to hand it back to you. So I'm now going to talk about the intellectual property. So we know that the very use of the word intellectual and property, we're kind of doing the genus differentia thing, where the genus is property and the differentia is intellectual. So there is something special about it. It's a kind of property, and that's what we're trying to define by the term intellectual property. But I'll begin by saying that intellectual property rights are not about protecting ideas. We use this in the loose, colloquial context of, oh yeah, we're protecting ideas. But actually that's not the case. It's about the right of exclusive control of material values in the real world. The ideas may have led to that. As I said, all values come from some cognitive process, but we're not protecting the idea. If I said we were, then just by reading a patent, you'd be infringing on it because your mind is engaged with that, and if that is illegal, well, there goes the whole match.
Well, just a brief interjection. I mean, some of your compatriots will say that there are rights to ideas.
I don't, and Rand never says that. So I would say that there are many incorrect interpretations. And I would say if you follow the right method and the right interpretation, you'll arrive at what I
All right.
think is the right approach. So
Fair enough. Fair enough.
okay, so as I said, it's about the right of exclusive control of material values in the real world. But
Okay.
there is a key difference between the nature of values secured by intellectual property rights and the values secured by property rights in tangible goods like land or an automobile. So there's a context. Remember, we talked about a different context. So now I'm going to get to why there's a different context, and that's why there are differences in intellectual property rights and tangible property. You know, you'll bring up the case of why are there time limits, etc. And but they follow the same genus, which is property, but there are differences. We acknowledge
Well,
the difference.
I'll bring up the fact that I mean you need to define what you mean by property and intellectual property in the first place. I mean, well,
Yes, I've defined property. I've defined property rights. I'm about to define intellectual properties. So broadly speaking, again, this is coming from the the two different two different types of material values. It's best understood by example, but while I'm going through the example, keep in mind that value is that which one acts to gain or and keep. So keep both those things in mind. There's the gaining and the keeping that are involved in value. So
I will, but so far I noticed that like you keep saying material value, but I've asked you to define material value, and I still am not sure what
the material value
I'm
is things in the world, and I'm going to show you in a few minutes, actually,
okay.
by example, how intellectual property is also about controlling material values, and it's
Okay.
not about ideas. That's my sort
I
of
mean, I'm going to ultimately ask you to defend what type of law you think is defensible, like like not just these general terms, which is fine, but like how does this boil down to you defending a particular type of law that is enforced by physical force, right?
if you
Patent,
ask me that.
copyright, trademark, trade secret, whatever. Like you have to translate this into what policy opposing or favoring.
It's a fair question. If you don't mind, ask me that in about 3 minutes or
Sure, go
2 minutes.
ahead.
So
Sure,
because
go ahead. Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
have to get to a certain point of
Yep.
what material values are in terms of intellectual property. And since you've asked that question, I really want to address that before we get into the topic of you know, enforcement and law and things like that. So I'm going to show this by an example. So let's say that a mutual friend of ours, let's say his name is John Galt, he invents a car that runs on heavy water or distilled water or something. Okay, let's say he calls it an H2O car. So
Okay.
by inventing the H2O car, he has used mental and physical effort to create a material value in the real world, which is the value that of reproducing the car is a material value. It is not an idea. It is the value of reproducing the car itself is a material value. Rand calls this dynamic value because each time a car is created, new value is created. It's not a static value, it's a dynamic value in the
Yeah.
sense that, but it is a material value. A
Yeah, that's
material
the
value,
argument against IP, but go ahead. I mean, yeah,
well,
that's the idea that people can copy ideas that are useful and use them in their own actions. Yeah. I agree with you so far, but
so
that's an argument against IP.
I'll let you make that case, but
Yeah.
if I may
Yeah, go ahead. Go
if I
ahead.
may
Go ahead.
continue. So the value in the material value in IP is actually the reproduction part of it. It's the reproducing is the material value. These are things in the world that come into being because the originator, the inventor, John Galt in this case, put in the mental and physical effort to make this available. And he then is, because he's the first guy to have done it, he's basically gets.
Wait. How do you know he's the first guy? You just
I
assume that.
this is an example. I said he invents. I said John Galt has invented an H2O car. So let's. So
Well,
people do.
well, hold on. Not to be nitpicky, but that doesn't mean he's the first.
Well, I know. Let's say he is the first. I mean, this to me, it's a distraction to say is he the first or is he not the first. I'm making in the example that John Galt has invented this thing which has not existed until he invented it. It is a fact that such inventions exist. So I'm not going too far afield by saying let's start with the assumption that he has invented it. It's an
I mean,
example.
there could have been a guy 10 years ago on another continent who came up with it, but then it faded away. I mean, he's not necessarily the first. That's all I'm saying is if you're going to hinge something on the fact that he's first, how do you know that?
Well,
And why is
that's
that relevant? Why is it relevant that he's first?
why is it relevant that the first homesteader has the value? So the point there is, if you apply it to that, it's the same conceptual approach that the first, however you define it, first to file, first to invent, those are again terms that come from legal philosophy, not even political philosophy, and they are aspects that we will have to get to in the inductive process of figuring all that out. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I'm saying when we're talking about a philosophical argument, let's focus on the fact that things do get invented. There can be someone, however you define it, is the first, and he invents the H2O car. So
well, hold on a second. I mean, not to derail you, but I mean, you can see that innovation is a cumulative process, I assume, incremental. Everyone builds upon previous concepts, right?
absolutely.
And you usually when a new invention comes about, like the light bulb or something like that, it comes when its time has come. It doesn't come because there was an Edison. Like,
Well,
in other words, there are many people trying to do the airplane or the light bulb or whatever at the same time, and they will eventually it will come about because the technology has come to the point where this will happen, and it could not have happened without the precursor inventions. So
and
everything
if
is
and it,
incremental and cumulative.
and if
Would you
it
agree?
does, and if it relies on previous inventions, those
Everything rely no, but this is my point. It's impossible not to rely upon previous inventions.
fair enough. And
Nothing comes ex nihilo, right, from nothing.
and
Everything comes from a context.
and we will get your question is basically leading us into the discussion of why should there be time limits, and we'll get to that.
No,
But
my question is not time limits. Where should there be property rights at all in coming up with a new recipe or way of organizing the matter that you have under your disposal? That you.
well,
But go ahead.
so the fact is that John Galt has invented this H2O car, and before that, now the antecedent events, whatever they are, let's say he has to use knowledge from before, and if
No, but hold on. He does have to. I
he
think you
does,
concede that, right?
absolutely.
There's no way he's gonna wake up as a baby and do this. He has to
I'm
build
not
upon knowledge,
I'm not
right?
suggesting that, but prior to John Galt, there was no H2O car, and now there is. Okay,
Well, there was an H2O car step -1, right? Whatever that was. I mean, there was something before.
and
Everything's
and
incremental.
and that too, if it was a material value that existed in the world,
Oh,
that was
Jesus.
then John Galt would probably license it from them. So those are, I think, details that we need to get into. But we're talking about a concept here where an inventor, what is the value that he has? That
Wait a minute. So wait. So but notice what you just said. He's going to license it from them. So like you're envisioning the society where this guy's got to just to exist in the world and to imbibe the technological concepts that have existed for millennia. He's got to run around negotiating licenses first.
Not at
Seriously?
all. Not at all. He might learn from a physics teacher, for example. And
Well, isn't that violating someone's goddamn IP rights? I mean, come on.
not necessarily. We'll get to that. You see, these are all important but derivative points. And if you're trying to get to the concept of when someone invents something, is there a material value that did not exist before? And whether he owns all of it or some of it, we can talk about that, and how much of that is owed to previous. We can assign all of that that's what this discussion can be about. But ultimately, there is a material value that the H2O car represents, and it's sort of like a farmer turning fallow land into a farm. It's sort of analogous to that. Now, let's say
it's analogous, but analogies don't make arguments, because
I'm trying to cement the idea and try to connect it to something that is familiar to people, so that they can say, oh, this is not something that's weird and radical. It is at least conceptually familiar to us. So let's
hold on a second. But that's all fine, but let's be clear. This is not something you have. You don't have an uphill burden here. You don't have to prove to people, hey, I'm trying to introduce this crazy idea of IP to you. We live in a world embedded in this idea. I mean, they already accept what you're talking about. So
well, but the point is that you're opposing even the fact that an invention can exist, and I'm saying an invention. So I'm starting my example with an invention. So if you don't mind, let me just go through this, and then we can get into other things. Feel free to ask whatever you want to ask about it. So what I'm saying is that this is a dynamic value that John Galt has, in that the value is represented by the materials that material value, because he can reproduce it. It's actually that reproduction of that which is a value that is protected, that is considered intellectual property. Now, let's contrast this with the other kind of property that is more familiar to people. So let's say a Marxist, someone like, let's say Bernie Sanders, comes along and buys one of John Galt's H2O cars. Okay, now that's a property that people actually understand. So let's say he buys a car, the entire material value is present at the time that the car was created, and then he bought it. So this is why it's a static value. So there's two different kinds of value. Things that you buy from someone, like which we all think are covered by property rights, those are static values. So Bernie did not create the H2O car, but here's what he needs to do. He needs to act to keep it, to maintain it. So he has to, change the flux capacitor every so often, or whatever he has to do in order to maintain it. So there's a kind of a burden on Bernie Sanders to do that. Now, Bernie Sanders, being who he is, will probably advocate for high taxes and basically tax himself out of existence. But that's a separate point. That's part of maintaining your property, is to also not attack the concept of property rights. So, but as long as that's going on, he gets to keep his property. So the point is that there are two different kinds of property, and the contexts are different. So intellectual property is actually that the material value is the patent is just a piece of paper. It's nothing more than a piece of paper. But what it secures is the material value of reproducing the mousetrap or the H2O car.
Yeah, but okay.